Muito boa tarde, sejam bem-vindas, sejam bem-vindos ao seminário da Hora do Almoço, neste novo ciclo do ano letivo 2024-2025. E hoje recebemos aqui no Salão da Universidade Aberta, com muito gosto, o Sr. Professor Christian Clark. Monsieur le Professeur Christian Clark, bienvenue à Lisbonne et à l'Université ouverte de Lisbonne. Et merci pour votre disponibilité pour présenter votre sujet de recherche aujourd'hui. Et j'espère que ce sera intéressant pour pour partager votre travail de promotion des droits de l'homme à partir de votre art graphique. O Sr. Professor Cristiano Clark tem desenvolvido um projeto muito interessante ao serviço da promoção dos direitos humanos, precisamente através da sua arte gráfica. E é precisamente isso que ele vai partilhar connosco nesta tarde e nesta sessão conduzida pela Sra. Professora Susana Alves Jesus, a quem passo a palavra. Sejam bem-vindos, sejam bem-vindos. Bienvenue, Monsieur le Professeur.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Muito obrigada por estarem presentes aqui na sessão presencial e também à distância. Vivamente vos felicitamos também aí desse lado. Muito obrigada pela presença de todas e de todos. É para nós hoje um grande gosto apresentar aqui Christian Clark. Eu vou ler aqui umas breves linhas do vasto currículo do nosso orador de hoje. Eu vou ler em inglês e de facto é um gosto ter aqui conosco o Christian, porque para nós que crescemos durante os anos 90, eu sou um caso desses, o Christian é uma espécie de herói, não é? Porque também produziu conteúdos para a Rua Sésamo, para a famosa Rua Sésamo, e também trabalhou com os estudos Ana-Barbera, com conteúdos como o Scooby-Doo, por exemplo. Portanto, it's a kind of hero for us we grew up on the 90s, so it's a kind of hero. Rua Sésamo, Sesame Street was a great school for us too. So Christian Clark is Yale Law School Human Rights Fellow and Fordham University Research Fellow. He's a cartoonist for Washington Post, Financial Times, Toronto Star, Guardian, etc., and two-time Emmy Award-winning writer for Sesame Street, who has written and illustrated 3 graphic histories, including the 2017 Untold, the real story of the United Nations in Peace and War. Christian has extensive international advocacy and human rights experience, working for the BBC and the United Nations in North America, Asia, Africa, and the Balkans. He led the MENA project for years, a groundbreaking UNICEF effort to advance girls' rights using animation for social change in Asia. Today, Christian take to us the GRAPHIX project and how through the cartoons we can defend human rights and make it near the children and the young people. It's a really pleasure to have you here, Christian. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
È un piacere stare qui oggi e obrigado per la recepción calorosa, especialmente per lo cantado ontem da noite con mi maravilloso colega, profesora Alves y Franco. Lamento que a mi presentación hoy sea en inglés. Prometo que la próxima vez que visitarmos será fiesta en portugués. Malo. Estoy muy ansioso para trabajar con todas voces en mi mudar para un maravilloso país que adoramos. So agora a la presentación. So as you could see, our project wants to be international and multilingual. And for me, multilingual, multicultural, and multi-country is incredibly important if we're talking about universal human rights and social action. This is a cartoon I did. This is going to be the cover of our book. And the symbolism, obviously, is the progress of human rights is like a snail. You know, it's very, very slow, but it's still going in one direction. Sure. And these days you have to wonder if the snail's going backwards. But we see over time, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so the GRAPHIX project, originally, it was a human rights education project that we envisaged. And it was to use the internet and cartoons to teach young people about human rights and the history of human rights. And for me, what's incredibly important is participatory research, right? That when I was a writer for Sesame Street, the success of Sesame Street is the education of the program, right? But you work with researchers to understand what the needs are. You work with the education content experts, and then you work with the artists. So for Sesame Street, the target audience were young children between age 4 and 6 who lived in poor areas and cities, who went to school without basic numeracy and literacy. So they didn't know how to read, they didn't know how to count numbers, and they were dropping out of school in unequal numbers compared to others. So Sesame Street tried to teach just basic alphabetation, numbers and letters. And the beauty of that communications intervention is, you know, before or after watching that program, if the child knows the letter A or the number 1. And they were able to prove that thousands of children didn't drop out of school because they actually had the basic numeracy and literacy skills. So it's quite an extraordinary approach that it actually has an impact. For human rights, it's much more difficult to show, are we successful or not? So the first thing we wanted to do was the research to see, do young people want human rights education? And after we worked with Amnesty International, the answer was quite a clear no. A lot of the young people that we talked to, especially in Africa and Asia, said human rights, that's a human, you know, that's a Western invention. Look at, you know, what Donald Trump is doing. Why do the Americans, you know, support the Saudis, but not the Venezuelans? It's political and it's useless. And it was very interesting for us to understand that perception. And the perception I understand in many ways. But when we would talk to the young people and say, well, the world's a better place, right, with a convention on torture, that the UN Convention on Human Rights was created after World War II, when, you know, when Europe was at war, where violations were happening. And so there is a context. So research doesn't always tell you what young people need, but it certainly tells you what their expectations are. So for us, we don't emphasize as much human rights per se, because when we did interview these activists around the world in many languages, so that it's multilingual, we want this to be youth-focused, inclusive, we did want to understand what they needed. So this I thought was important just to read. Maybe you could read it, because this is at the heart of our research.
Slide 4.
Yeah.
Declaração do problema, ou seja, localização do problema. Os jovens ativistas e artistas carecem de uma plataforma online segura para conversar, aprender e conectarem-se uns com os outros, enquanto o poder da arte e dos quadradinhos gráficos, como um meio mais acessível e universalmente compreendido, ainda precisa de ser verdadeiramente explorado para promover o desenvolvimento humano, os direitos humanos e a justiça social.
So that's what we found with the online research that we did with Amnesty International. So we did an online survey in 3 languages with 200 human rights organizations. But when they're saying they want connection, when they're saying we have suspicions about human rights, it's not something that you can just find in an online survey. So I was actually quite surprised that Yale University, their law school, liked the project, and they said, come for 3 years, and we can actually do formative research. And formative research is when you do interviews, obviously at the local level. And what we said we wanted to do is what we call snapshot interviews. So be sure in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, we interview young people using the methodology from Amnesty International. So with McGill University, where I'm from in Montreal, their Faculty of Education, we created a survey, a questionnaire, and we started interviewing activists. And one of the things that came up very clearly is the most important thing that young activists want is they want a connection to other activists. So they don't want Yale University to tell them what to do. They don't want, older people to have workshops and train them up. But there's a real thirst for activists to talk to other activists, for artists to talk to other artists, and for them to share experiences. And so the point of the project that we started to understand was to showcase activism in its many forms and cultures across the world. But for us, it's through comics and graphics. We're not saying we're doing everything, but how are they using art for social change, social media? The second they were saying was they wanted an online platform to connect. And we worked with Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, to say what kind of platforms are out there. And what was really interesting was they're saying the world doesn't need another human rights Twitter, right? We don't need a Twitter sphere where everyone's arguing. And at the same time, it's not the responsibility of a Western university to organize communities of practice, right? That they're already out there. So what was suggested by MIT is we create a platform where we highlight who does what where. We allow activists and artists to find where other partners are. And so we're a connector. And then finally, we really do believe that the comics and graphics are an untapped medium for human rights. So these were the 3 things that we went into the research at Yale with. And this is just a slide about the project. We have advisors, former head of the Human Rights Commission for South Africa, former head of the Human Rights Commission for Afghanistan, former Undersecretary General for the High Commission of Human Rights. So we have really high-level people who know their business, because I'm a cartoonist. I'm the first to admit I don't know a lot. I know a lot about cartoons. And then second, the research was really important over a 4-year period, because we wanted to be sure that what we're doing, because if we're saying we're representing young people and we haven't interviewed activists in the Middle East or North Africa, then this isn't a global project. It's not a global project if we're only doing interviews in English, right? It's very skewed. And that was the second thing that really struck me, not just, or there's some suspiciousness or concern or misunderstanding about human rights, but also the Anglo-centric nature of the whole human rights industry. I was, as a Canadian, you don't see when you're a male and you don't see how men, do stuff. And then a woman, your wife tells you, and then I never thought about that. But a great example is we signed an agreement with the Association for Human Rights Institutes, representing 80 universities around the world. And I thought, finally, we're an international organization. We're going to have almost all those universities are in Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, and United States. 2 universities in Africa, 2 universities in Latin America. And then that's when I started thinking about the criticism of human rights. It's just, it's American. And then I started to understand that perception, right? And we don't hear the history in the Lusophone world, right? Of human rights activists in Guinea-Bissau, artists in Cape Verde, what's happening in Angola. And as we start doing this mapping, we're seeing more and more, there's some amazing work being done and nobody knows, right? So all we do is we get a very skewed view of the world. So one example is we're working with the High Commission for Human Rights in Guinea-Bissau. because I was asked by the head of, to help them help young people tell the story of human rights in Guinea-Bissau through cartoons. So I said, great, we'll work with a local art school. And they're like, there's no art school. All right, we'll work with a local human rights institute. And they're like, there's no human rights institute. We'll work with the university or the law school. It's very weak and there's some problems. Okay, then we'll work with a local political cartoonist. And they're like, we don't have any. And this is what we're facing in so many countries, right? The lack of capacity, which in turn creates a problem because that doesn't allow communities or those countries to tell their own stories. So those stories are always interpreted by others. So what we ended up doing was we found there's only 3 comic human rights organizations in the world. One, Cartooning for Peace in Paris, that was started by Kofi Annan, who was the ex-Secretary General. There's the Cartoon Movement that's based in Amsterdam, and they bring together cartoonists from around the world. And there's also an organization called Cartoonist Rights, which protect cartoonists. So he said, how can we help train up cartoonists in Guinea-Bissau? And they were like, let's get other cartoonists in Africa to help other cartoonists in Africa. So we're working with a wonderful Angolan cartoonist I'd never heard of, and he's amazing. He's won all these human rights prizes. So the more we do the research and the mapping, the more we see there's so much out there. So initially, you see, it's just very Western focused, right? I'm very American. I'm Canadian, but my wife is Indian and works for the UN in New York. So, I've worked with local universities, and we realized we really needed to get beyond just the American academy. Next. All right. Oh yeah, so you already know about me. That's so these are some of the universities we're talking to. We have no money because I refused to fundraise until we finished the first phase of research. Like I said, to interview activists and artists in the Middle East and North Africa is so difficult. In Iraq, we're talking to the High Commission for Human Rights, and they're saying we'll put the lives of activists in danger if we talk to them. And then they say, of course, you must have an Arabic speaker who's fluent, and not just an Arabic speaker, but someone from the Levant, where you have different types of Arabic spoken, right? So if you actually speak like as an Iraqi to somebody in Saudi, they'll notice a difference, and they'll be so how do we get interviewees from those countries to actually do the interviews? But also, how do we build the capacity in those countries? Because it shouldn't just be Yale students interviewing people, right? So we're working with these, but on a volunteer basis, and it's really not easy. So we have a big board of directors from all over the world, and some really very, very cool people. An activist who runs an anti-sex trafficking NGO in Calcutta. Tay is an amazing director from Nigeria. Nadia is in North Africa. She's Moroccan. She's the head of advocacy for Amnesty International. So we have some really very great people. And like I said, here are some of the advisors, the head of the Human Rights Institute in University of Nairobi. We have great artists who are helping us, but we need more artists from Africa and Asia. And then finally, just, so the book, we're still working on the book. What we've done is we've taken 2 pages of the history of human rights book, and we've been testing them around the world. So it's a cartoon. So for instance, one of the things is it says, so there's all different cartoons. So one is like, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declared the rights of all human beings. And then you have a little cow saying, what about us animals? And it's like, oh, no, it's inalienable rights of beings. And they're like, speciesists, right? So we're trying to be, because the activists and artists say, we want sarcastic, right? We want funny. We want our parents to be upset if they read this, but we also want to learn something from it. And what was surprising is I thought my wife's from India. I thought maybe the Hindus might not like the cow, but they thought that was pretty funny. But the people most upset about that the cow were human rights experts who said, oh, you can't equate human rights with animals. That's a completely different genre. And I'm saying, no, it's a joke, right? It's funny. We're just contrasting. No. This is unacceptable. And sometimes, academics can be a little bit humorless, right? But we know our material's not for them, right? Our material is for, and it's to engender discussion, right? We're not saying, oh, the UN's a great place or human rights is the best thing. But here it is with all the flaws, right? With all the contradictions. What do you think is the world, does that help you if you're an activist and you can actually hold your government accountable on disability rights? If the UN Declaration on Disability, the government has to have hearings every, I think it's 3 to 5 years. So that's an opportunity for activists to actually embarrass their governments. So the UN and human rights are imperfect, but they're still useful, right? And it needs to be better. So this is about showcasing what people are doing. It's about giving a little bit of the context of the history, how slowly rights come into being, and it's always imperfect. And then this is the question, the last part, just when we said, what's the most important thing that we could do as a book? And they say, give us examples of young people in Africa and Asia who are doing stuff, and they're really doing good work that we could learn from. That's more important than knowing about the Malalas and the Greta Thunbergs, right? We want to hear stories and we want to be connected. So again, this is the idea for the online platform. And this goes way beyond our project, right? So that young people are saying, we want gamification, we want learning modules, we want master classes, we want lesson plans for schools. And that goes far beyond what we're able to provide. And so that's why we're saying that we want to facilitate a website that will bring together different people. So this isn't a graphics project, but this is a graphics project that brings together different universities like yours, different languages. And like I said, that the target audience is basically 13 to 23, but we know, like with Sesame Street, the target audience are 4 to 6-year-olds, but everyone loves Sesame Street, right? So even if our specific target audience is 13 to 23, that's where we would do the evaluation, right? That were we effective with that target group? Others might like it, but that's not as important. And for us, the thinking is, since young people say the most important thing is to be connected, then the evaluation can also be around, do you feel you've been able to learn more from others? Do you feel the lessons learned has applied and has been helpful? So we think that's how we're going to do the evaluation, not did you overthrow your government, right? Did you stop pollution? Did you stop AIDS? Did you stop climate change? Because those things are impossible. And one of the things that I do want to do with you is this mapping country by country. So we did a wonderful mapping of Myanmar, and it was extraordinary how these young people are opposing the junta. It is absolutely extraordinary. I had no idea. And the more we looked into this, the more we realized we don't need to teach. All we need to bring is the experience of others. But it's also a little bit dangerous by saying, as an old man, the Myanmar activists, the Thai activists, and the activists in Hong Kong use the 3-finger movement. It's from the Hunger Games, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know, like, okay. But it's so my daughter's like, oh yeah, that's really cool. And so I had a call with a university in Serbia, and I thought I'd show I'm pretty cool for an old man. And I said, in Thailand, they use the 3-finger movement. You could think about doing that here. And they looked at me and there was silence. And then someone said, that's the salute for the fascists. So I learned as a white guy, I shouldn't suggest. I can provide, you choose, right? So we do need to be neutral in that sense. But that was a big learning lesson for me. Each context is different, but the overall situation is similar. And then finally, I'm so proud. Maria Ressa, she won the Nobel Prize in 2021. She did one of the best books I've ever read called How to Stand Up to a Dictator. We're doing a graphic adaptation of her book. So this was just confirmed last week. And we'll be able to bring that book, because my daughter doesn't read. My daughter's 21. I bring her books. She doesn't read. Then I bring her graphic books, and she's like, maybe I'll read. But like we said, that this is such a great form for reaching young people. But also at Princeton, where she was, they assigned the book to all freshmen. So you know what's going to happen, right? We're going to get all the readers for that book for the kids who don't want to read the book, but they'll just read the graphic. So this is a tricky thing on our part. And then we have another book called The Water Defenders, and it's about how community groups took on a Canadian gold mine in El Salvador and won. It's a very famous book, and we're doing an adaptation. Arya Nayar, I'm sure you know, he founded Human Rights Watch, Helsinki Watch. He's done a book called A History of Human Rights. We're talking to him about adapting his book. And then Politico, the online news thing, is we're negotiating with doing a graphic explainer of migration. And then, like I mentioned, Guinea-Bissau, the Scottish Youth Parliament want to use our methodology. And we're working with the Globe and Mail in Canada. So if anything is missing, you write it down. It's a long presentation. And I just wanted to, end by asking how we can collaborate. So I don't know, in Portugal, do you have the same thing where opportunity knocking, they knock on the door and opportunity dead? And so here's death instead. So that's my sense of humor, but thank you.
Thank you.
Obrigado pela sua extraordinária apresentação, o seu projeto tão interessante e que se enquadra também naquilo que é um projeto importante que está a ser desenvolvido no nosso centro, que é o projeto da Wikipedia Global, que está a ser coordenado pela senhora professora Sanal Jesus, que coordenou esta sessão, e a quem agradecemos toda a organização deste evento, e certamente aqui em conjunto temos de fazer projetos interessantes para expandir ainda mais este que é um dos ideais fundamentais do nosso centro, que é a promoção, o conhecimento e a capacitação da nossa comunidade, mais alargada, desde as escolas até as pessoas em geral, para os direitos humanos. E realmente o seu trabalho é um complemento extraordinário e um instrumento extraordinário para este esforço que é de todos nós, que é nós enquanto centro de investigação, enquanto universidade, mas enquanto país, mas também enquanto humanidade. Nunca é demais, nunca será o suficiente o que fizermos para defender e promover os direitos humanos, porque é uma espécie de vaso frágil, tem que ser muito bem cuidado, porque todos os dias ele é ameaçado. E hoje em dia, nos tempos que correm, nunca tiveram tão ameaçados como hoje podemos ver. E, portanto, o que estamos a fazer em termos de ciência, em termos de arte, em termos de trabalho de promoção e de educação para os direitos humanos, nunca será pouco. E por isso queremos agradecer imenso. Bienvenue à Lisbonne. Nous sommes enchantés à votre présence et on espère avancer ensemble. Merci beaucoup.
Ok, merci.
Obrigado pela vossa presença nesta tarde e vamos continuar então este trabalho neste ano letivo que agora começa, em torno deste e todos os outros projetos que temos em curso. Obrigado pela vossa presença e pela vossa participação. Até breve.